Well, in just 2 weeks' time, October 6th, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg will deliver the 2020 federal budget. After 6 months of economic upheaval caused by the pandemic, this could make or break the nation's recovery. It will certainly see the budget covered in a sea of red ink. We know that now already, don't we? According to the Australian's editor-at-large, Mr Paul Kelly, this budget is, he says, one of the most important since Robert Menzies founded the Liberal Party. He joins me now from Sydney. Paul, terrific analysis of where we might land in a couple of weeks' time. You've set 3 tests for this budget. Let's go through them in turn. We'll start with the first test. Will Morrison and Frydenberg produce budget numbers showing the corner has been turned on massive government support? We had reports from our colleague Andrew Clennell last night that JobKeeper won't continue beyond March next year, so I assume that means your test has been in part met.
Well, we'll have to wait till we see the documents, of course, Peter. That's always the story with these budgets. But I think the point about this budget is that it's the response to an extraordinary crisis. So it will be a big spending budget. We know that from the decisions announced so far. It'll be a high deficit and high debt budget. So the test, I think, in terms of the spending will be whether the government puts in place the transition from JobKeeper, which is supporting existing jobs, to new programs that create new jobs. Now, that's a very difficult balance, but it must get that balance right. And in a sense, that's the transition that's required for the government to say, we are committed to a recovery phase. We want to look beyond simply stationary support, the way things are. So that's the first test. It'll be a very important test for the government. It's a very delicate balance, but clearly they'll be moving in that direction, and that's very important.
All right, you're right to admonish me too to wait for those budget books when they land in 2 weeks' time. Goodness me, I should know better. In the lockup, it's one of the... it's a challenge. It'll be a challenge this year, actually, in COVID conditions. Your second test, and this is interesting, given we have a national cabinet that's supposed to be far more collegiate than COAG in previous times, but we've seen its failures on borders and schools in particular. Your second test is, will the premiers destroy it? What do you mean?
Well, the budget is going to be framed on the assumption that the economy will open up and that internal borders will open up. And that's sensible. That's the position of the Morrison government. And for any substantial economic recovery, those conditions will be essential. Mm-hmm. But for those conditions to be realised, we have to have the premiers on board. In particular, we have to have the Victorian economy being opened up, and we have to have borders being opened up, particularly in those resistant states of Queensland and WA. Now, if these premiers decide that they're not going to be responsive, that they're not going to open up their economies and borders, then that will undermine and has got the potential to sabotage the budget strategy. Now, I'm assuming at the end of the day they will see reason and they will act, although one can't be certain about this given the extent to which they cherish what I call pandemic protectionism. We did see some encouraging signs yesterday in terms of the borders, but a lot more is needed.
You make a very good point. I mean, if you go back to the GFC, when Australia had 1 quarter of negative growth, the only thing that kept us out of a technical recession was in the second quarter, when a lot of other industries went under. Agriculture remained in positive terms and prevented a recession back then. Now, big agriculture states, WA and Queensland, will be a real test here, whether retail spending we know is up, whether agriculture can pull us out of the hole later on in the year. But more broadly, you know, the test for the premiers at the moment, the way they've set in populism terms, is closed borders and the metric every day of how many cases, how many deaths, not how many bank foreclosures, how many people have lost their homes, all the other economic assessments that they should be wearing. But I suspect their strategists have said, leave this for Scott Morrison, it'll all be his fault next year. Do you think that voters in these communities, these 2 big states in particular, are now seeing that their premiers have to take some responsibility for the economic health of the state, not just the biological health of the state?
Well, I'd like to think that's happening, and it should be happening, but there's not a lot of evidence of that so far. And one of the extraordinary features of the politics of the pandemic is that premiers are being rewarded for taking extremely strong stands, whether it's the lockdown in Melbourne or whether the closed borders in Queensland and the West. The premiers are being rewarded politically because the perception is that they're looking after the health of the community. Now, that is in many ways a dubious proposition, but we won't go into that now. But just in terms of the basic argument, there's no doubt that the communities and the public have put health before the economy. Now, how long they do that is very hard to say, but that's a real problem for the Morrison government, because you're completely correct. The Morrison government is going to be held responsible for the economic recovery and for the condition of the economy. And if the premiers are simply judged by health and not the economy, then that's going to create a very significant problem for the national government.
And of course, let's not forget the federal government is likely to go to an election before Victoria goes to an election at the end of 2022. But just going back to that point about, you know, this has succeeded for the premiers in a popular sense. We're only judging that on polls. We've got no other test other than we will have with the Queensland election at the end of October. We're all judging this on polls. And I have to say, to be brutally honest, polls have failed us in recent times more than they've actually proven the electoral reality. So are we backing these state premiers in, or are they backing themselves in on the basis of polls and give a damn about the economic damage, when we might find the polls are a rude awakening for what actually happens in the ballot box? And we'll have lost a lot of our economic strength by then.
Well, that's correct, Peter. I mean, we learnt from the last election there was a question mark about the polls. So we need to bear that in mind when we look at these results. I would make a couple of points. I think it's very interesting if you look at the most recent news poll in Victoria and Queensland. While Andrews and Palaszczuk are rating well, Scott Morrison rates stronger than them in both those respective states. So what the poll is showing is that there's actually a very significant dividend for Morrison, and in fact a stronger dividend for Morrison than for the premiers, which I think is an important point. The other interesting question, of course, is there's a specific question put about approval or disapproval of the policies, and that shows that the policies, if you take Victoria for example, the policies are becoming less popular. That is, I think about 35 or 37% of Victorians were now expressing concern about the lockdown. Now, of course, you can say, well, why only that small number of people? I mean, it is just more than a third. But you can see the trend that's underway there. Of course, that might be qualified later on if the Andrews lockdown, and this will happen, of course, sooner or later it will be successful in terms of reducing the number of cases. So what might happen at that stage? Will he actually receive some sort of further kick in the polls? We'll just have to wait and see.
But it's worth noting too, if you look at the metrics in both of those polls, Queensland and Victoria, vastly different experiences with COVID. One state got back to normal relatively, other than the border closed Queensland quickly. Victoria is still in lockdown, the longest and toughest lockdowns now in the world. But the rating right across all the various indices in the news poll for both premiers was about bang on the same numbers. Now, no one in Queensland would think that Victoria's handled it well at all, but how they were rating Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland was about the same as the rating for Daniel Andrews. So I think this is sort of a poll on the pandemic. Now, are we getting through the pandemic? Well, yes, we are. In Victoria, we've gone from 700, down to sort of 15 cases today. But Victorians, I don't think, have forgotten and weren't asked the question, do you know who started this second wave? And does that bear on your reading of the government's performance? That wasn't in the poll, and I think that's where I'd be digging into if I was a pollster.
Well, I think there's a lot in that. I mean, clearly there would be a tremendous amount to investigate here in terms of qualitative research. That is, who do people hold as being responsible for the second wave? And then you'd be able to get beneath some of the obvious results we've got in the news poll in terms of approval, satisfaction and dissatisfaction. I think this is the sort of challenge where you do need very concerted research, qualitative research, to give you a much greater insight into how the community's thinking about this.
And you can bet the political parties will be all over that. Paul Kelly, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.